This is episode 1 of a series of conversations I had with Bob Cooley. And who is Bob Cooley? Bob is responsible for bringing down the Chicago mob, or as the locals call it, the Outfit. The Outfit was the criminal enterprise that Al Capone crafted and put in motion in the 1920s. Over the decades, the Outfit morphed into a blob that consumed all operations of government in Chicago up until the 1980s. Bob Cooley was a lawyer for the Outfit, a fixer and an insider. He fixed the legendary Harry Alleman murder trial and was counsel for Pat Marcy, the mob-appointed politician who ran Chicago and Illinois from the First Ward. Bob knew almost all there was to know about the inner workings of the Chicago Outfit, an organization that had politicians, police, and judges as members. But one day, Bob did the unthinkable. He turned on the bad guys and divulged all their secrets to the FBI. Bob's enlightenment brought down powerful politicians and esteemed judges and forever decapitated Capone's legacy. I met Bob years ago after he wrote his book When Corruption Was King. We discussed turning his book into a movie, and recently we decided to tell his life story through these recorded conversations. We start at his childhood, as I wanted to better understand the world that shaped him and his outlook on life. I think you'll find his story engaging and entertaining, and along the way, there are revelations about unsolved murders, accusations against judges, and sitting politicians. Chicago does the extremes like none other, and Bob Cooley is one story inside this maelstrom. One technical note, these recordings took place in the spring of 2022. Bob was located somewhere in the western United States. The conversations were recorded by me calling Bob. Sometimes you'll hear dogs barking in the background, phones ringing, call waiting beeping through. I did my best to try to clean these things up, but we did not have the perfect recording situation where we were both in one controlled environment, so I apologize for any annoying technical elements that bleed through the conversation. Thank you for listening, and here is episode 1 of the Cooley Account. Bob, what year were you born and where were you born?
I was born in Chicago. I was born on July 10, 1942. I was born in a hospital on the south side of Chicago. I was the third one in line. There were twins ahead of me in a family of 9 kids, 7 boys and 2 girls. My father, at the time when I was born, was a Chicago policeman. My mother was born and raised in Pittsburgh. My grandparents, on my mother's side, lived in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh. In fact, I know for a fact she was. Her father was a policeman who was also killed in the line of duty. My father's father was killed in the line of duty in Chicago. He was killed by a member of the Al Capone mob.
What details do you know about your grandfather's murder?
Well, I knew a lot about it. My father, at one time, when I was just before he died, that's when my father told me that the case had been fixed. My grandfather's case had been fixed by the mob there in Chicago, and I never realized that. I never realized that, at least my father thought the case was fixed. I never knew about that until, my father mentioned it to me pretty much on his deathbed. What had happened was he apparently tried to stop a robbery over there on South Michigan Avenue, just south of the Loop, and he tried to stop a robbery, and the robber wound up, reaching over the back of his head and shooting and killing my grandfather. Well, he didn't kill him on the spot. I guess he laid in the hospital for a long period of time before he died. Because my grandmother told me about that, when I got to be very close to my grandmother because I worked for a store called Beremus where I delivered the groceries, and she happened to be a customer. And I would deliver the groceries to her when I was a kid.
Did your grandfather's death, was it one of these things that was in the background as a child that you knew about, that was pushed to the side?
No, I mean, had nothing to do with my growing up or whatever, and I probably never knew anything about it until I got much older. When I became a policeman, I saw his star there. I would see his star there when I go to 11th and State, and his star was up there on the wall with the other policemen that were killed in the line of duty.
You're a child of Chicago, obviously, a child of the South Side.
There were 9 of us. There were 9 kids, 7 boys, and there were 7 boys and 2 girls. As a kid, I was very angry. I was very angry as a kid because I felt my parents had no business having all these kids because we were basically the poorest people in the poor neighborhood. And I was really very angry growing up about that because, all my friends had so much more than we had. Well, there were twins ahead of me. The oldest one who became a priest, and his twin was a girl, Pat. I was the third in line, and the rest were all behind me. We had to move. The first place was 7428 and Vernon, South Vernon. That was St. Columbanus. And I remember that at that time there were about, I think there were only about 4 of us or whatever. Yeah, we were the poorest family, even in that neighborhood. I was also the smallest kid in my class growing up all the way into high school. I was constantly getting beat up, because the neighborhoods were changing, and they had what they call blockbusters. We had to move 3 different times as I was growing up. The first place, like I say, we lived 74th and Vernon, and we lived there until I was still in grammar school. I was up until about third grade or so, and then we moved to 74th or 76th and Langley. And I remember the doorbell ringing, and my mother would answer it, and I'd hear somebody say, "There's a black family going to move in down the street. You might want to sell your house now before the values go down." Just about every day the doorbell would ring. Then what would happen is the black family would move in, and we'd have police cars out there, in front of the house because people would be picketing or whatever, complaining about it. 3 different times we had to move. My father said that it was time to go. It was time to go when somebody got killed on our block. That was when he felt he had to move the family. He was an honest policeman, and obviously money was very, very tight.
Were your parents good parents?
The best. Both my mother and father, every day, Mass and Communion, 6:00 in the morning. They were very, very devout Catholics, both of them. And they gave up their whole world for their kids. Never took a vacation. I remember one vacation we had when we were all shoved into a car and we went off it was upstate New York. And that was the only vacation I ever remember we had. And boy, was it a pain in the neck because all of us shoved into one motel room and the rest of it. But they gave up their whole lives for us. That was their whole life. I realized this as I got older. I never had a legitimate set of clothes that I can remember until I went to college and I got a suit for the first time. All my clothes were hand-me-downs. My mother used to work over at the Catholic Church, and she would bring home food, after the different things there. And as I said, a lot of my fights when I was a very young kid were because people would make fun of me because I was wearing their clothes. Those are my clothes. No, they're not. And I'd get into a fight. But being the smallest of all, up until the time I decided I was going to put a stop to that, I was always getting beat up.
So the smallest, the poorest, and then you have it rubbed in your face that you're wearing these recycled hand-me-downs.
Or my mother was always over there at the church, working there. In fact, I found out as I got a little bit older too, they charged at the Catholic schools, but not for us, because my mother had to work it off for all the kids. Never had a car. The only car we had was my father with the squad car that he could take home. He was a detective, and he could take home the car, but we never had a car until the first car that we had, I remember, was a pink Plymouth. It was a long way to school, but even in the wintertime, I preferred walking to school. And after school, my mother would pick us up, and I would hide because I didn't want to be seen getting into that chunky looking pink Plymouth. I hated being poor. That was probably what really, motivated me down the road. When I think about 6, 7 years old is when I started working. The reason I wanted to work to make money was so I could eat. I hated vegetables. I would never eat vegetables. And in our house, it was almost all vegetables. The only time we had meat, I remember, would be round steak, they called it at the time. And it was like shoe leather. My mother would dip it in flour and fry it, but that was the only meat I remember we would have in the house, and I would not eat the vegetables. In fact, I would sit there at the table. For 2-3 hours afterwards because I would not eat. In fact, what I would do, I would throw the food behind the refrigerator. In the first place, the 74th and Vernon, I would throw it behind the refrigerator because I would sit there in my seat right by the refrigerator, and I would throw it back behind that, or I'd have it in my mouth, and after a while I'd have to go to the bathroom and I'd spit it out, or I'd put it in my pockets or throw it out the window. I would not eat vegetables. And
are these traditional family meals with your mother and father at the table and all your siblings?
That was always the thing my father always insisted on was a family dinner. That was ultra important. It was the family dinner every day at 5 o'clock. At 5 o'clock would be the family dinner, and because he would have to work, he always worked 2 jobs or 3 jobs, and he would have dinner, and afterwards he would then go to work wherever he worked. I don't know. When I was real young, I have no idea where he would go, but he would go out and work. He would never be home. I detested him because there was nothing for me to eat there. I would not eat vegetables. When I say vegetables, I'm talking about broccoli, asparagus, cauliflower, those things that have that odor. I just couldn't.
Are you vocal about this? Are you telling your mother?
Oh, well, yeah, well, sure. When she tried to make me, I would throw it up sometimes.
Are your parents demanding that you eat these? And if not, you're getting
my
the
mother.
belt? Or
my mother,
backhand,
yes.
Or?
Oh, they never hit me. No, never hit me for something like that. That was an interesting part of my childhood, too. My father didn't believe in corporal punishment, which I thought was great. But my mother was the one who tried to discipline us, and she would just say, you will sit there until you eat it. And that's why I said I would sometimes, dinner would be over by about maybe 5:45 or so before, because my dad had to leave. I remember he would have to leave at 6 to go, probably doing security work or who knows what. But I would be there sometimes until 9 o'clock because I would not, until it was time to go to bed.
You were locked to this table, and are your siblings mocking you and the pile behind the refrigerator is growing?
Well, they didn't know that until we moved. They said nobody realized I was doing that until we moved. When we moved to 76th and Langley, we took our refrigerator with us. At that time when you moved, we took our refrigerator with us. And when they pulled the refrigerator out, the food, you could see it was the food that had been accumulating there for years. It was almost like, how can I describe it? Like, a piece of cardboard. It looked like cardboard straight up because it had been building over a long period of time.
There's no secrets, are there? Did your mother find this humorous, or
no,
was she doubling down on the vegetable intake?
No, but she would put the food out there for everybody, and I would ignore mine. But what I would do too, as I said, I would sometimes, when she wasn't looking, she'd have to go and wash the dishes. We never had dishwashers, and she would be going to wash the dishes or doing things, and that's when we had a dog, Jose, too, a little Chihuahua who would eat whatever I would hand him. And I'd try to feed, I'd try to put the food down there. But I remember one time, it was a real bizarre experience. I come home from school and I come in, we had, as I say, it was a real old house. And I come walking in through the back door. My mother grabs me by the ear and takes me downstairs. The washing machine was downstairs. And puts my head, actually had to almost pick me up because I was smaller than the machine. And I look in there and I see a bunch of peas bunch of peas in the washing machine. And I said, how do you know that was me? They're funny experiences now, but I mean, no, my mother, nobody ever hit me. My father did not believe in corporal punishment. In fact, what was interesting about growing up, my father would not discipline us. And my mother, when we do something, my mother would try. In fact, she would have us bend over the bed, purse with a strap. And as we got a little bit older, with an ironing cord, and, hit us a few times. And it got to the point where, as I got to be even like 10, 11, 12, I would put my hand up and try and stop her or whatever. And she'd say, your father will punish me when you get home. And when my father would get home, he wouldn't come home until 9 o'clock, 9:30. I'd be in bed and pretending I'm sleeping. And I told the story. I don't know if I told it in the book. And what happened, on one occasion, I was always getting into trouble. One of the things, I was always getting into fights, and I was always throwing stones. And on one occasion, this was in their second house. This was over at 76th and Langley. In all our neighborhoods, none of the alleys were paved. It was always dirt. These are all dirt alleys. Across the alley from us, a black family had moved in. And I was in the alley, and I was throwing stones. And I don't know what I was throwing at, but I broke a window at the house, and I ran away. And, nothing happened for a while. So I went back out. And when I came back, the black guy was standing there, on our porch, on the, towards the back, going with a little stairway going up to the door.
When you say black guy, you mean the neighbor, the gentleman that owned that residence or whoever lived in it.
The one whose house I had broken the window. I had told my mother when I came home. I told my mother my brother Bill broke the window. Bill was 2 years younger than me, and I told my mother that my brother. I said, Bill, Bill broke that window. Bill broke the window across the alley, and then I went out. And I was out in the alley playing, and that's when the guy came over, and he said to my mother, your one son broke the window, and she said, yes, I know, he's back in the house, and I'm punishing him. And that's when he told her, no, it's the one down. I just saw him down the alley. Time when I came back home this time, my mother was really angry, and she, told me to bend over, and I just said no. I was getting stubborn like that. I'm not going to let you beat me with that, with that ironing cord. And so she said, well, when your father comes home, you'll get punished. This happened. I remember it was a Sunday when this happened, and the reason I remember it is because I was in the living room when my father did come home. And I figured, well, this time my father had never hit me. Had never. He didn't believe in corporal punishment. He believed, God will punish you and whatever, which I thought was great. He says, my mother says, Jim, she said, and she told him what I did. Now, you've got to punish him. You've got to start punishing him. I'm about maybe 12 years old, probably somewhere around that at this time. And he said, I'll punish him. I'll get him later. I'll punish him later. I want to get something to eat because I have to go back out to work. And she said, and she really got angry at him. No, you punish him. So my parents' room was, you walk in you walk in from the front room and you turn to the right, and that's where my parents' room was. A door leading in from the living room, and there was a door on the other side which would be right alongside where the bathroom was. We only had one bathroom in the house for 11 people. He closes the door. He tells me to bend over the bed. The other door is also closed. And he had his police belts. He had in his closet there. And he has me bend over the bed, and he starts hitting the bed. He doesn't hit me. He hits the bed, and you can hear whack, whack. I better make some noise. So when he does that, I started, and I was so loud, my mother thought he was beating him. He was killing me, and she opens the door. She sees him hitting the bed, and with that, she goes ballistic. And he now does start to hit me with the belt, and hit me so hard I climbed under the bed to stop it. And he picked up the bed he was a big guy. He picked up the bed with one hand and was still trying to hit me. And I am crying now because it does hurt. And I go into my room, and about 20 minutes later, my dad comes in there, and he's crying and apologizing for what he did. I mean, it was a real bizarre situation.
Tell me a little bit about your father as a detective. What kind of cases did he cover, and how that shaped you moving forward towards your decision to become a police officer, but more about your father's psychology as a detective. And what I mean is, having worked with detectives creatively, they have a mindset and an approach because of their work that can often shape them as human beings and how they interact with people in a good way. In most cases, did your father, was he shaped by his job, and how did that affect you?
I know exactly where you're coming from, and I never thought about being a policeman because they didn't get paid any money. I hated being poor as a kid. I just wanted to, as soon as I could, get finished up and start going to work and making some money. But policemen didn't make any money. They were, unbelievably low salaried. I do remember my father was a detective from the time that I was a kid. He was no longer in uniform. He was a detective. And the reason I remember that is because my father was an honest policeman and as a policeman and a detective who would not take any money. At Christmas time, when I became a policeman, I realized this. People give you gifts. They just do. Businesses, liquor stores give you some liquor, other places at Christmas time. And the policemen all go and stop in these different places, and they give them gifts. My father would not accept even those Christmas gifts. He was he just didn't believe in it. There was another policeman who would be at the house all the time. His name was they called him Tiny Allman. He was a big, big, fat policeman. I don't know what his first name was, but they called him Tiny Allman. The reason I remember him is he'd be in there all the time. And I remember him making fun of my father because he was so honest. When I remember as I'm walking by, he's saying, "Why, listen to you. You have to work all these other jobs. What's the matter with you? It's all legitimate, to get rewards and take money and whatever." And, and my father just, said, but he's making fun of him because he won't take, any money. And he's working these other jobs when Tiny's, is doing very well, driving a nice car, and the rest of it was obviously a crooked cop.
Does your father talk about how corrupt the police department is or other crooked cops?
No, never. You got to understand my father. He was the way he was. The other policemen all loved working with my dad. And I found out all this when I became a policeman and I started talking with these different people. They all loved working with my dad because when they would stop to go get gifts, they'd say in something for the other policemen and they would keep all of it. They would get extra that way. They loved working with them because my father didn't want any, but would never say anything about what they're doing or whatever. And that was why he never got promoted, I'm sure. He never got promoted. My father was a brilliant man. But, when I became a policeman, again, a lot of these people fell in love with me, these other policemen and all, because of, the way I was as a policeman and all the awards that I got, and others would start talking to me and they loved my dad. They loved him because of the way he was, but, and they really respected him in every sense of the word. But I remember as a kid, there was a magazine, True Magazine, that would constantly do stories about my dad and about arrests that he made with the cartage detail. There was a cartage detail because of all these mob guys that were, hijacking all these trucks.
Cartage detail. What is that?
Cartage. That's, when these trucks that are transporting, suits and clothes and everything else and valuable stuff. It was a special unit in the police department there were so many robberies going on and hijackings. I'm sorry, hijackings, not robberies, but they were hijacking trucks there in Chicago. Trucks with $100,000 loads of clothes and suits and electronics and whatever. They were hijacking the trucks, then stealing all the merchandise. They started a detail of special unit of about 6 policemen or detectives, and my father was one of them. They would strictly work on those, on getting, on making arrests and recovering the property from these hijackings. Eventually it was the mob. It was the mob that was doing it, obviously. They made so many arrests and they put a stop to all of them that they cut out the detail. And the reason, I know the reason why they did. Same as when the detectives were making, when they were making all kinds of arrests there for gambling. That's when Hanhart was made the chief of detectives. And the thing that he did was he put a stop to allowing the detectives to make any arrests in the Chicagoland area. I mean, I know why. Eventually, they disbanded the unit. After about 3 years, they disbanded it, saying there's no more need for it. And then the hijackings all picked up again. And that's when my dad got transferred over into recruit processing.
I want to go back to something you said about your father, which is that he was a genius.
He was so naive in terms of the ways of the world. To be a priest, you go through college, and then you go through all kinds of other stuff. He was a Carmelite, which really helped me down the road and kept me from being kicked out of school at Mount Carmel. But he was a Carmelite, where he was in the seminary, and you finish up with your 4 years of college, and then you go into other training. But I find out again all this later. I didn't know it as I was growing up. My father was the one that was involved handling all the finances for the Carmelite order, and our whole family wound up, every single one of us wound up going through college and scholarships of one sort or another. My father was was a brilliant man in terms of, but not in terms of the ways of the world. Was unbelievably naive. As a policeman, you're supposed to, you go for this in-service training. You're supposed to go once a year, for shooting. When I was a policeman, and I was there at the training at the academy, I'm talking with one of the instructors. Oh, Bob, Cooley, any relation to James? To James? That's my dad. Oh, okay. And he's telling me, he eventually tells me a funny story about my dad. My dad, you're supposed to go every year, with, and then you bring your gun or whatever, and you do your shooting. And my dad apparently hadn't gone for years and years. And finally, when he was told he had to go, and he took out his gun, the gun wouldn't fire. The gun was so old and rusty or whatever. This guy told me the gun would not fire. The reason he took the job was because at that time he had the twins, and when he had the twins, he had to get a steady job where he had a steady paycheck. That was why he went in the police department. Prior to that, what he was doing when he left the seminary, like I say, he had already taken some vows. In other words, in the seminary, you go in there and you take some vows that, you'll never get married, and you'll never do this, and you'll never do that. Those are the final vows. Before that, you take certain other vows. What they are, I didn't know. Just before he took his final vows, apparently he was in Pennsylvania, and that's when he met my mother. That's when he met my mother. I saw her picture. She was a beautiful, beautiful woman when she was younger, and he fell in love. And that's when he, at the last minute, got out of the seminary. Bill was a very, very devout Catholic, and initially, the job he was working was as a collector, not like Marco or Rick or whatever. He would collect for people that owed money on credit cards, or for buying a furnace or whatever. where he would go and knock on doors, or because he would tell me, he eventually told me some stories about that, how what he would do is he would call people. He had a phone book that with every address would have phone numbers. It was a reverse phone book or something, but whoever the people were living in that address. And what he would do to collect some money is he would call somebody at about 4 a.m. He would call the next door neighbor and say, "It's really, really very important. Can you get so and so?" And the person would go and knock thinking it's an emergency, knock on the guy's door, and when the guy would come over, to answer the phone, he'd say, "Pay your money. You owe the money. Pay your money." He would tell me different ways that he went about collecting it. But the problem with that was it wasn't guaranteed money. It was strictly a commission. That was why he wound up going in the police department, because it would be a steady paycheck at City of Chicago. It wasn't much, but it would be guaranteed money. And from the time he joined the police department, he always had 2 or 3 other jobs. So that's why he went in the police department.
Interesting. And are you raised in an environment where the city of Chicago and the politics of Chicago are a topic of conversation in positive or negative ways? I was raised in a household where politics were never really discussed. My years of being in the house with my family were the 70s and the 80s, but my parents didn't talk about politics. My parents didn't talk about what was going on in Chicago. Granted, I grew up in the shadow of the city, but it wasn't a conversation in my household about, the city's so corrupt and daily this or the mob's doing that. Now, I remember things through the paper or the radio. For you, is this stuff are these conversations in your sphere?
No, they never discussed. There was never anything at dinner. At dinner, we just, what did you do today? And, how was your day and whatever.
Beyond the dinner conversation and just you yourself, are you, Bob Cooley, shaping an idea about what your universe is and what Chicago is, in the sense that, like, this is a great city, I love being here, Chicago's awesome? Or is it, this is a corrupt hellhole and it's a machine city and I need to get out of here for greener pastures or better environments?
Oh, no. I never had any thoughts about any of it, politically or anything else. No, from the time I was about as young as I can remember, 7, 8 years old, even younger than that, I was always working, trying to make money. We're talking pennies.
Tell me about that. At 7, 8 years old, you're working?
Oh, yeah. At the age of about 7 or 8, what my mother had us doing was collecting papers. I remember we got a penny a pound. That we would go out every morning. I'd have my red wagon. We'd go out every morning and up and down the alleys, up and down, and pick up. Everybody threw their papers out in the back. It wasn't like now. You just threw the papers out in the back, in the back, and somebody would come by. They had people with big trucks that would come by and would pick those up. That was part, it was a big business for them, even though it was only like a penny a pound for us. But we would go out and collect papers all around the neighborhoods. I would stand out in front of the grocery store when I was about 7, 8 years old, even younger. And, can I help you carry your groceries? To these women, the older women that would be coming in and out. And I'd do it for a penny or two. And sometimes they would say no thanks, but they would give you something. As I got a little bit older, I was probably about 11 or 12, and my mother got a paper route. The ones that would be out there with her doing the paper route would be my older brother, Steve, and myself. By the time I was in grammar school, I was in 7th grade. I wound up with 4 jobs. I had a paper route at that time. I had my own paper route, which I did. I'd get up at like 5 o'clock in the morning or 4:30 in the morning and do my paper route. I got a job at Verima's grocery store up on 79th Street. I would go over there right after school. I'd get $1 a day, and I'd work there from, I think it was around 3:30 or 4 o'clock until about 6. And my pay would be $1. It would be $1 a day. And I would deliver the groceries from him, and I would get some tips from the people that way after I delivered the groceries. And what I loved about the job was he would make me something before, and I right down the street at the other corner, there was a drugstore. That was Spectre was the name of the drugstore. The guy was an older guy named Spectre, and I convinced him that I could go to work from 6 o'clock until he closed at 9. And again, he'd give me $1. I would get paid $1, but I could deliver the drugs to people, and I would get tips from doing that. A lot of times you get like a nickel or a dime, but I mean, that was big money. That was big money at that time.
You're working 3 to 6, you go down the block, and then you're working 6 to 9 for the drugstore.
See, I was always able to maneuver and manipulate. With Spectre, what he had me do along with the deliveries, he was a small drugstore. There was a bigger drugstore. In fact, it was on 79th Street. It was about a mile away, and it was right down the street from where I lived. He would have me go over there to get some of the drugs that he didn't have. In other words, somebody would want a prescription, and he'd need some of the drugs. There was a much bigger drugstore down the street, about a mile or so away. So, I had my bike, and I would drive over there. When I was there, I would see that they had some deliveries to go out, and he had somebody that was, working there delivering for him. And I talked to him, and I said, look, I can make a couple of these while I'm waiting for you to get my prescription stuff ready. And now I started working there too, just when I would come back and forth, but also I would work there during, sometimes, at other times I would start working for him. So I wound up having about 4 or 5 jobs at the same time. Here's where I would make some money. My mother wanted us to turn in all the money that, she opened an account for all of us. And when I say all of us, that's after me. I was supposed to give her all the money that I made, and she would give me a little something, to basically live on. But what I would do is, she'd have no idea, what I'm making with tips. And even like when I caddied and the rest, when I started caddying, then after that, I would not tell her how much I made. I would have my own little stash.
Is she trusting you that you're handing over all the money? Or is
she just assumed that I was.
And is that money going into the family pot?
I thought it was going into, and that's why I'm thinking, I'm a little kid. Why the hell should I be paying the bills for these other people? I thought she was doing that. She told us that she was opening up, a savings account, for us. And I must, and I figured that she's just, because I know how poor we are. I remember one of the other things that got me really angry and embarrassed. We didn't have a car. The same store where I used to go and stand out in front and say, "Can I carry your groceries?" That was a place where she would go shopping. And when she would go, I'd have to walk with her, and we'd take my little red wagon and we'd go in there. And as she's walking through, she would look for cans that are dented or whatever. Now, they didn't have registers like they do now, where you just swish things across. Every single item is like, put in by hand. She would say to him, "Can I get a penny off this or a couple pennies off that because it's, dented and whatever?" And I would be so embarrassed. Here I am only 6, 7 years old, but I'm humiliated by the fact that we have to do that. I understood later. I loved my parents later, and I still love them at that time. When I went to college to Marquette, I had a wrestling scholarship, which I'm sure my father had a lot to do with that. When I went to Marquette, I was able to buy the first suit of my life. I never had a suit before. My mother gave me my bank account. I had accumulated something like about $1,500, which was huge money. All those nickels and dimes and and dollars that I was turning over, she had been saving. Every single penny of that was put into my account. She had actually taken all that money, much as they needed the money, whatever. She had taken all that money and put it in my account.
So that concludes episode 1. Stay connected for episode 2 as we discuss Bob being thrown out of Marquette University and the years prior to him becoming a police officer.